The rain had been steady since dawn, casting a gray wash over the cracked sidewalks and glistening streets. Inside a small corner diner tucked away on the edge of the city's downtown district, the warmth of coffee pots and the low hum of conversation offered a brief refuge from the gloom outside. The bell above the glass door jingled as it opened, drawing a few glances from the patrons seated in vinyl booths or hunched at the counter. In stepped a man with tired eyes and a heavy coat, its fabric worn thin at the elbows, its seams stained by time and weather. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and walked with a noticeable limp. His boots were caked in dried mud, and a military duffel bag hung from one shoulder like a silent badge of hardship. He paused just inside the door, scanning the diner slowly, his expression unreadable. Some customers returned to their meals while others watched him, curiosity mixing with unease. The waitress behind the counter offered a polite but hesitant smile as he made his way to a booth in the back, away from the window, where the view of traffic lights blinking through rain wouldn't follow him. He slid into the seat quietly, placing his bag beside him before picking up the laminated menu. A few moments passed before he raised a hand, signaling the waitress. She approached, and he asked for coffee and a sandwich in a voice deep but soft, measured and respectful. She nodded, scribbled on her pad, and moved away without incident. It wasn't long before the diner door swung open again, this time with less subtlety. 2 police officers stepped in, shaking off water from their jackets. They scanned the room, exchanging brief words before their eyes landed on the man in the back booth. Something unspoken passed between them, an assumption, a decision made without inquiry. One officer approached the counter, muttering something to the waitress that made her eyes flick toward the booth. She looked uncertain, biting her lip, but gave a slight nod. The other officer strode purposefully toward the man, his hand resting on the hilt of his belt, near the cuffs, near the radio, near the weight of assumed authority. "Sir, can we talk for a minute?" the officer asked, his tone rehearsed and firm. The man looked up from his coffee, blinking slowly, and nodded once. "Sure, about what?" "We got a call about a disturbance. Mind showing some ID? No disturbance here." The man replied, keeping his voice even. "Just having lunch." The second officer joined, arms crossed, eyes scanning the table as if expecting to find a weapon or a hidden bottle. One of them leaned down slightly. "We're gonna need you to step outside, sir." "For what reason?" "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the first cop said, the familiar phrase landing like a threat in a place already heavy with judgment. Other patrons began to notice the tension. Forks paused mid-air. A child peeked over a booth seat before her mother gently pulled her back down. The air in the diner thickened with discomfort, but no one moved. The waitress stood behind the counter, her eyes darting between the officers and the man in the booth. The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or challenge the officers. Instead, he nodded slowly again, his composure striking in contrast to the rising tension. He reached into his coat, deliberately slow, careful not to spook the men standing over him. He produced a battered leather wallet, opened it, and showed a worn veteran's ID alongside a driver's license. The officer glanced at it and seemed unimpressed. "Where you staying these days?" The second officer asked. "Where I can." He answered. "That's not really an answer." The first officer pressed. "It's the only one I have." The silence that followed grew sharp. The officer's hand crept closer to the radio mic on his shoulder. The man's posture never changed. He took a sip of coffee and reached, instead, for a phone from his coat. One of the cops stiffened. "Don't make a call, sir." "I think I will," the man said. "Just one. Let me know when you're ready for the next keynote expansion." The phone in his hand was scratched, its screen cracked in the corner, but it worked. He tapped a number from memory, lifted it to his ear, and waited. The officers looked at each other, uncertain now, but neither stopped him. The man said nothing as the line rang once, then again. On the third ring, someone answered. The man's expression remained unchanged, but his tone shifted, becoming slightly more formal, more precise. He identified himself by full name, gave a brief summary of his location, and then said just 4 words. "It's happening again, sir." The officers could hear the words, though they didn't seem to understand their meaning. The man said nothing else, only nodded once to whatever was said on the other end and ended the call. He placed the phone gently on the table and returned his gaze to the coffee cooling in front of him. A few seconds passed in silence before one of the officers, feeling the weight of stillness growing heavier, tried to reassert control. "Sir, we're gonna have to ask you to leave the premises. We've gotten reports." "What reports?" A woman's voice interrupted from a few tables over. It was the same waitress, no longer behind the counter but now standing with her notepad held to her chest. Her eyes were wide but steady. "He didn't bother anyone. He just ordered a sandwich. He was polite." The officers ignored her and looked back to the man in the booth. "Ma'am," one said over his shoulder, "please stay out of this." She didn't move. Another voice joined in. A middle-aged man at the counter, who had been quietly sipping his coffee but now swiveled on his stool. "I've been sitting here since he came in. There was no problem. Why are you targeting him?" A third voice, younger, added to the mix. "This doesn't look right, man. You didn't ask anyone else for ID. You just walked in and went straight to him." The energy in the room shifted. What had been an awkward silence now turned to subtle defiance. Patrons who had pretended not to notice now openly stared, their expressions ranging from discomfort to disbelief to quiet anger. Someone pulled out a phone and began recording. The officers noticed, glanced at each other again, and their stance wavered just slightly. The veteran didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge the support. He simply waited, hands on the table, eyes steady. His demeanor hadn't changed since they walked in, and now it was the officers whose calm began to crack. They stepped back, one murmuring something into the radio clipped to his shoulder. The response was quick, terse, and whatever was said made his eyebrows tighten. Outside, the sound of sirens cut through the drumming rain, not the urgent wail of pursuit, but the short, direct chirp of approaching patrol units. The officers inside exchanged another look, this one tinged with something more than confusion. Their posture straightened, like boys being caught misbehaving. A few moments later, the door opened again, letting in a rush of cold, wet air and a pair of sharply dressed men in suits, badges already displayed. They walked directly to the booth. One of them extended a hand to the veteran, who shook it firmly. The younger of the 2 agents turned to the officers. "We'll take it from here." The senior officer opened his mouth to object but thought better of it. He nodded instead, stiffly, and stepped back. The man who had made the call remained seated, still calm, still silent. The patrons in the diner watched closely, caught between confusion and amazement as the agents spoke in low tones to the veteran. The officers stood awkwardly to the side, no longer the center of control they had been just minutes ago. Their shoulders sagged with something like realization. The waitress came forward again, placing the sandwich on the table with a trembling hand. The man nodded at her, his first real acknowledgement of anyone besides the officers. She gave him a look, somewhere between gratitude and apology. He nodded once more. The tension that had suffused the diner had not fully disappeared, but it had shifted direction. People began speaking again, softly, cautiously. The one recording with his phone lowered it slowly, unsure what he had just witnessed, but certain it meant more than what appeared on the surface. The man picked up his coffee again and took a sip, the steam now curling into the cooling air as the rain continued outside. The presence of the 2 agents changed the atmosphere immediately, but for the officers who had initiated the confrontation, the shift was more than uncomfortable. It was threatening. The taller of the 2 cops, the one who had done most of the talking, stepped forward in an attempt to regain some semblance of authority. His voice was a little louder now, laced with defensive pride rather than confidence. "With all due respect, we responded to a call. We had reason to believe there was a disturbance. We followed protocol. The agent didn't flinch, he didn't raise his voice or push back with attitude. He simply said, "There was no call logged to this location from dispatch in the last hour. So let me ask you again, why are you here?" The officer hesitated. His partner shifted uneasily. The veteran sat silently through it all, watching without expression, his hands folded neatly in front of him. The agent turned to him briefly, nodding with an assurance that said far more than words. The other agent stepped aside and began speaking quietly into his phone. His body half turned away as he looked up at the security camera mounted near the ceiling. People in the diner had stopped pretending to eat. The same patrons who had spoken up earlier were now simply watching, waiting, their collective gaze a kind of judgment the officers couldn't ignore. The cop who had initially threatened the veteran now glanced toward the door, perhaps hoping this would end soon, but it didn't. The agent looked back at the officers, this time with a small leather notebook in hand. "You approached a citizen sitting peacefully, demanded ID without probable cause, then attempted to forcibly remove him from a private business based on your own judgment of his appearance. Did I miss anything?" "No, sir, but..." "You also ignored the business owner's staff when they said no complaint had been made. You proceeded to escalate despite the absence of any crime. I'm asking again, why are you here?" The silence that followed was punctuated only by the soft clink of silver, whereas someone at the counter put down a spoon. The officers were clearly caught, but pride wouldn't let them admit fault. The taller one shifted tactics. "We've had issues in this area before. Vagrants, disturbances, sometimes drugs. We're doing our job." The agent nodded slowly, as if giving the illusion of consideration. "So by your logic, homelessness is now probable cause for harassment." "That's not what I said, but it's what you acted on." The agent closed the notebook and looked directly at the veteran. "Sir, we're filing a formal complaint on your behalf. Internal Affairs will want to speak with you. In the meantime, you're free to stay as long as you wish. We'll see that you're not bothered again." The veteran gave a small nod. The agents remained standing by the booth, but their attention now focused more on the officers than on the man they had protected. One of the patrons leaned toward another and whispered, "They messed with the wrong guy." The veteran hadn't said a word since the phone call. His silence seemed deliberate, like someone who knew from experience that words could be twisted, but actions stood firmer. The waitress returned, this time with a small glass of water and an apology in her eyes, though she didn't speak it aloud. She placed the water gently next to the sandwich, which now sat mostly untouched. The man gave her a quiet, thankful look. The agent who had made the phone call stepped back into view, giving a nod to his colleague. He had finished his conversation and returned with a determined look. "The footage confirms everything." The officers entered the establishment, made no inquiry of the staff, approached the individual, and proceeded to escalate without provocation. The officer tried to interrupt, but the agent raised a hand sharply. "You're both being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Hand over your badges and service weapons, now." The diner fell completely silent as the command echoed through the small room. The officers froze. The weight of the words landed heavy and real. One of them, the young, reached slowly for his badge, hesitated, and then unpinned it from his chest. The clink of it landing on the counter seemed louder than it should have been. The other followed suit, wordless and pale. Their weapons were carefully surrendered, placed in the small evidence bags the agents carried. No one in the diner moved. Even the rain outside seemed to still. A sense of gravity filled the space. The officers who had entered with casual entitlement now stood diminished, shadows of the authority they thought they wielded. The moment the phone call was placed, the dynamic of the confrontation had subtly but unmistakably shifted. The veteran hadn't raised his voice, hadn't argued, hadn't shown anger or fear. He had simply pulled out his phone, dialed a number that clearly held weight, and spoken a few calm words. No theatrics, no pleading. Just a quiet message, laced with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. The officers, still posturing, hadn't noticed the change at first, but the people around them had. The man at the counter with the coffee stopped drinking mid-sip. The waitress lowered the coffee pot she had been holding. Even the cook in the back, visible through the open kitchen window, had paused, ladle in midair. There was something about the veteran's tone, something unmistakable. It was the voice of someone who had dealt with real command, who had been in rooms where decisions held consequences far beyond a neighborhood diner. The officers had continued with their line of questioning, still pushing, still trying to assert control, but cracks had started to form. The veteran didn't flinch or argue when accused of loitering. He didn't get defensive when one of them casually asked if he had anything on him. He simply looked them in the eye and waited. That kind of patience doesn't come from indifference. It comes from experience. From knowing that sometimes the best way to win a battle is to let the enemy reveal themselves. When the phone call ended, the veteran didn't speak again. He didn't explain who he had called. He didn't tell the officers what was coming. But others in the diner could feel the change. The energy shifted like air pressure before a storm. There was no visible lightning, no rumble, but something was clearly building. The officers noticed it eventually when they realized the man at the counter was recording, when they heard whispers from a nearby booth, people quietly recognizing what was happening, maybe even who the man was. The officers hesitated just slightly, enough to show they weren't entirely sure they were in control anymore. One of them stepped back, the hand that had been hovering near his belt finally falling to his side. The second officer, the younger one, glanced toward the window. Rain still poured outside, but there was movement on the street. Black SUV pulling up without sirens, men in dark suits stepping out, badges already out in front of them. Not local police, not internal affairs. These were federal, serious. The diner fell silent again, the clatter of plates and soft jazz from the jukebox fading into background noise. The first agent walked in, speaking briefly to the officers, then turning his full attention to the man in the booth. He offered a hand, not in a show of force but in respect. The veteran shook it, his grip firm but not exaggerated. They exchanged words quietly, their conversation not meant for the rest of the room, but the meaning behind it was clear. A second agent entered soon after, speaking quickly into a phone while scanning the room. His eyes landed on the security camera near the entrance. He nodded once, said a few more words into the phone, and then gave a slight signal to his colleague. The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, stepped aside as instructed. Their authority, once assumed, now stood stripped by the presence of men who didn't need to raise their voices to command a room. The call the veteran made wasn't to a lawyer or a news station. It hadn't been a desperate plea or an emotional outburst. It was a report to someone with power, someone who knew who he was and had the means to intervene instantly. The speed at which the agents arrived, the seriousness of their response, told the rest of the story. This wasn't just a man with connections. This was someone who had earned those connections in service, someone whose name still carried weight in circles far beyond that diner. By the time the agents finished speaking to the officers, the crowd in the diner had transformed from passive observers to active witnesses. Some had recorded the incident from start to finish. Others had quietly stepped in with their own comments to the agents, offering what they saw, what they heard. People who normally might have stayed quiet were emboldened by the sense that justice might actually take root in that small room. The balance of power had tipped, not through violence or outrage, but through presence, through a single, strategic call that summoned accountability without the need for explanation. The officers stood still as the agents moved efficiently around them, collecting statements, reviewing camera footage, speaking with the staff and several of the diners who had stayed behind. The veteran remained seated, untouched by the chaos that had once swirled around him. His silence still held power, and the authority that had briefly tried to challenge him was now unraveling in real time. The agents didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Every word they spoke, every instruction they gave, carried the weight of procedure, accountability, and officialdom. These weren't men who guessed or speculated. They were sent because someone had called and that someone mattered. Word spread quickly through the diner that the man in the booth was not just a veteran, but a highly decorated one. Not just homeless, but a former commanding officer who had served with distinction in multiple combat zones. One of the agents confirmed quietly to the waitress that the man had once advised top-level defense officials. Another diner overheard that he had received commendations not commonly handed out. Whatever the details were, one thing became increasingly clear to everyone in that room. The officers who had profiled him had made a critical miscalculation. Within the hour, news vans had begun to park across the street. Someone had sent the footage to a local reporter. It had gone viral before lunch had even ended. The title was short and sharp: "Officers detained decorated veteran without cause." The diner's name was tagged. The city, too, faces of the officers, partially obscured but still identifiable, filled thumbnail previews on video clips already racking up thousands of views. The two agents didn't comment when asked about the story. They focused instead on making sure the officers were removed from the premises with minimal spectacle. But even their silence spoke volumes. One of the officers, now stripped of his badge, stared at the floor as he was escorted outside. His partner looked out toward the street where the cameras waited. The weight of consequence was finally beginning to settle on them, not because they had been physically stopped, but because the truth of their actions had been laid bare and captured without excuse. No amount of explanation could twist the footage into something different. There was no misunderstanding that would cover the sequence of decisions they had made from the moment they walked through the diner's door. Inside, the veteran finally stood up, moving with a slow, deliberate motion that spoke of years of wear and training. His duffel bag remained where he'd left it, and he reached for it only after adjusting his coat. The waitress approached him again, this time with a sense of gratitude so deep it was hard to express with words. She didn't apologize directly, there was no need, but her expression said everything she could. She offered to wrap up his meal for the road, and he gave her a soft nod. A few patrons clapped quietly, the sound awkward but sincere. Others simply watched, unsure what gesture would be appropriate, but knowing they had witnessed something significant. The agent who had first shaken his hand walked with him to the door. Outside, the agents held back the press long enough for the man to leave without confrontation. No statements were given. No interviews were granted. The veteran didn't need to speak. The story was already being told, not by him, but by the people who had seen what happened and couldn't unsee it, and by the evidence left behind: body cam footage, surveillance recordings, witness statements, digital timestamps, pieces of truth that would now be used to hold those two officers accountable. Later that same day, the department released a statement. It was brief, sanitized, the kind of press release designed to minimize fallout, but buried within the language was the core message: the two officers involved had been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. That same evening, a city council member called for a broader review of how homeless individuals and veterans were treated by law enforcement. Local veterans organizations issued responses of their own, rallying support around the man many now knew only as the veteran in the diner. Social media exploded with commentary. Some praised his restraint. Others focused on the irony that a man who had risked his life for his country had been profiled by those sworn to protect it. Still others dug deeper, uncovering past complaints against the officers involved. The story had grown larger than a single encounter. It had become a symbol of unchecked authority, of dignity under pressure, of what it means to truly serve and still be mistreated. The agents never disclosed who had answered the veterans' call or what exact title they held. That part of the story remained private, tucked away in the network of relationships built not on status but on earned respect.